One of the things that being online allows you to do is to experiment with different identities that are disposable, and that are virtual. And then I also thought that to the degree that childhood is being extended and maybe interfered with, especially at the early stages when pretend play should be occurring and there's so much screen time, that experimentation with identity, which is a form of play, might be being extended out into adolescence and further on. So you get virtualization and the extension of fantasy play. It's not surprising to me that iGen young people would be, what would you describe it as, very open in relationship to their proclaimed identity, especially also if they're earning attention points for announcing a non-standard identity and also having no other identity to replace it with in some real sense. Well, it's a strange individualism though, because it's based again on what you might describe as maximization of short-term identity. It's sort of the claim is I can be whoever I want, and all social regulation of that is nothing but an imposition, which is really not true at all, because most of the time following social principles allows you to form relationships with other people and opens up horizons of opportunity to you. That's the benefit of sacrificing not exactly individuality, but short-term individual whim. And it's something that children learn as they mature, right? They can't get everything they want right now, but the payoff for that is that they can get along with other people and that things work better over the long run. That I would say, understanding that and then abiding by that principle of medium to long-term well-being is something like maturation. And this individualism that you're describing isn't really, I don't think it's not an enlightened individualism because it's too short-term. It's more like, well, I am whatever I feel I am right at this moment. And to me, that smacks of, well, nothing more than, in some real sense, like a 2-year-old immaturity. And I mean that technically, because 2-year-olds are very whim-oriented, very, very short-term, and very self-centered. They can't play with other people. And so you have the dissolution of identity, right? There's no community, no real community, not in terms of community organization, but also not in terms of real face-to-face friendships and interactions. There's no participation in religious enterprises. There's no real reading about political or philosophical matters. There's a decline in spirituality. So there's a real collapse of sophisticated identity. And all of this, well, the sexualization of identity seems to me to be, in some sense, what would you say, a replacement for that or a reaction to that. Does that seem on point to you, or am I missing something there? Well, you talked in your book, in Generation Me, you talked about the self-esteem movement. And self-esteem has always been a particular bugbear of mine, I would say, especially since I discovered that psychometrically it was basically composed of low neuroticism with a bit of extroversion thrown in. And so self-esteem is a proxy for neuroticism in many, many ways. And it isn't obvious to me at all that you treat neuroticism by treating people to be more self-centered. One of the things I used to do with my clients who were socially anxious, say, when they'd go into a social situation, they'd start obsessing about how they were appearing to other people. They'd fall into that trap, and then they'd stop making eye contact, and then they would get awkward, and then they would engage in non sequiturs, and the whole conversation would grind to a halt. And I asked them instead to concentrate as hard as they could on putting the other person at ease. And that gave them something to think about other than themselves. And so the self-esteem movement was predicated on the idea that people high in neuroticism had low self-esteem, which I don't think was true at all, and that the right remediation for that was to treat everyone as if they were uniquely special. So it was like narcissism was the antidote to neuroticism. Right. And that's right. It's so appalling.
It doesn't work.
No. In fact, it makes it much worse.
Exactly.
I'm relieved to hear that your sentiments are in keeping with that formulation. I mean, I've been trying to base it on the relevant data, trying to figure that out. Chapter 10, independent politics. So what about, well, you said that the iGen people, they're not watching the news. The news is dead, right? I mean, legacy media news is dead. I don't think anybody watches it. I think old people have the TV on, and that's where the ratings come from. So that's just gone. That centralizing ability that the nightly news had to broadcast a similar message in some sense to everyone and bolster identity, that's disappeared too. Everybody's in their own news I wouldn't say bubble exactly, but it's fragmented so much that there's no unity of apprehension. What's happening on the political front with the IGN types?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things going on. So one is that a lot more young people now say they don't want to belong to a political party at all, that they are politically independent. And that's been going on for a while.
Yeah, well, that atomization of political identity, it's another interesting twist on the notion of individualism, because you might say that not joining a political party, not joining a political group, not joining a religion, not cementing a local social network, let's say, frees you up because you're not constrained by the necessity of abiding by the principles of those groups. But the problem with that is that, and this is something that people don't really understand well about choice, is there's not a lot of difference between excess choice and anxiety. They're very much the same thing, right? If you have too many pathways open in front of you, and I can't help but think that this is contributing to the epidemic of depression and anxiety. I mean, if you have a 3-year-old who wants to dress himself and you open up a closet full of clothes, he or she is just generally stumped into immobility. If you lay out 3 outfits on the bed and say, pick one, then they're perfectly happy because they've had the right amount of constrained choice. And we've been teaching young people that all social norms are nothing but constraints on this individualistic freedom. And that completely underplays the role that identity plays in encapsulating anxiety. You know, I was talking to Carl Friston the other day, a neuroscientist, and he's convinced, as are many people, that our conceptions are entropy management techniques in some real sense. So, you know, once you define yourself, for example, within the confines of a given identity, now you're playing a bounded game that might open up an interesting amount of options, but not so much that you drown. And to lose all those intermediary social structures, except maybe the bond you have with your parents, that strikes me as a mental health catastrophe.